Welcome to our deep dive today. Looks like we're diving into some pretty dense stuff from the philosopher Byung-Chul Han. You shared his book, The Burnout Society, with us and some of his other writings. And well, we're excited to sort of unpack some of his key arguments and figure out why they matter so much today.
Yeah, Byung-Chul Han definitely offers a unique perspective. He's suggesting that maybe our modern obsession with positivity and achievement, the kind of yes we can attitude, is actually creating a new type of violence, one that leads to exhaustion, depression, and just a constant sense of not being good enough.
It's funny, when you think about violence, you usually think about something physical, right? Or aggressive. But Han is talking about something much more subtle, this violence of positivity. How does that even work?
Well, he argues that in our pursuit of achievement, we end up exploiting ourselves. It's like we become both the slave driver and the slave at the same time. Instead of being forced by some external authority, we force ourselves to constantly do more, be more, achieve more. We're always on, optimizing every aspect of our lives, our work, our leisure, even our relationships. And it's this relentless pressure that Han identifies as the real violence.
So it's almost like we've internalized this pressure to perform, to constantly be exceeding expectations. We've created this internal pressure cooker that never really lets up.
Exactly. And Byung-Chul Han points out this is a shift from the kind of disciplinary society that Foucault described. Foucault focused on how institutions like prisons and factories, they used physical force and strict rules to control people. But Han argues that we've moved beyond those external structures of discipline. We're in a performance society now where the pressure comes from within.
That's interesting because it seems like in a performance society, we're not just told what to do, but how well we have to do it. And that can be really draining, even if it comes from a seemingly positive place.
Right. It's not about someone saying you can't do this. It's more like this constant message of you can always do better, be better, achieve more. And that creates this impossible standard that we can never really meet, leading to a sense of failure and inadequacy even when we're objectively successful.
And Han links this directly to things like depression, ADHD, and burnout, right? He's saying they're not just individual problems, but they're actually symptoms of this larger societal pressure to perform.
Precisely. And it's interesting because he sees these conditions not as a result of too much negativity, but almost as a collapse under the weight of too much positivity. He suggests that this constant striving, this inability to ever feel enough, is really damaging to our mental and emotional well-being.
I see what you mean. It's like we're drowning in positivity, but it's not actually nourishing us. It's just creating this relentless pressure to keep performing, to keep striving, to keep pushing ourselves beyond our limits.
And that brings us to one of Han's most striking arguments. The idea that this pressure to perform is actually a form of violence. He calls it the violence of positivity.
Now, I think for a lot of people that sounds counterintuitive. How can positivity be violent? Isn't positivity supposed to be a good thing?
That's the tricky part. He's challenging our assumptions about what positivity really means. He argues that when positivity becomes this relentless demand for achievement, it can actually be quite destructive. It creates a situation where we're constantly pushing ourselves beyond our limits, ignoring our need for regular recovery, and ultimately we sacrifice our well-being for the sake of performance.
So it's like this self-inflicted violence, driven by this internalized pressure to constantly be achieving and exceeding expectations.
Exactly. And Byung-Chul Han points out that this violence of positivity is particularly insidious because it often comes disguised as self-improvement or even empowerment. We're told that we can achieve anything if we just work hard enough. But this message ignores the very real limitations of human beings. We need rest, we need connection, and we need to accept our own imperfections. Han's point is that the violence of positivity denies us these basic human needs.
So if this violence of positivity is so pervasive in our society, how do we even begin to recognize it in our own lives? Where do we see it playing out most clearly?
One place Han points to is the loss of contemplation. He argues that our constant bombardment with information, our obsession with multitasking, and our inability to just be present, these are all symptoms of this deeper societal problem.
It's like we become so accustomed to being on all the time that we've forgotten how to slow down and just be.
Precisely. And Han argues that this loss of contemplation is incredibly damaging because it robs us of the ability to truly see and experience the world around us. We're so busy checking our phones, responding to emails, keeping up with our to-do list that we miss out on the simple joys of being alive.
And it's not just about missing out on joy, right? Han also talks about how this constant state of hyperactivity and distraction actually prevents us from developing deeper levels of understanding and creativity.
He makes a great point there. He argues that deep attention, even boredom, is essential for creativity, for cultural development, and for our ability to connect with ourselves and the world around us. He contrasts our modern state of hyperattention with what Walter Benjamin called the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience.
That's a beautiful image. It reminds me of how we need those spaces of quiet and stillness to allow our minds to wander, to make new connections, and to truly process our experiences. But it seems like our culture of constant stimulation is actively working against that.
Exactly, and this is where Han's work gets really interesting. He argues that this loss of contemplation, this inability to truly see and be present in the world, is a direct result of the violence of positivity. It's this constant pressure to perform, to achieve, to be on all the time that's driving us toward this state of hyperactivity and distraction.
So to really understand what Byung-Chul Han means by the violence of positivity, we need to look at how it impacts our ability to think, to be present, and to engage with the world in a meaningful way.
Yes, and this is where his analysis of Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener becomes really insightful.
Okay, let's talk about Bartleby. He's such a fascinating and enigmatic character. For those who haven't read the story, it takes place in a bleak Wall Street office where everyone is consumed by work. Bartleby the Scrivener, he starts out as a really diligent worker, but then he begins to withdraw, famously responding to every request with, "I would prefer not to."
Bartleby's passive resistance is really a key part of what makes things so intriguing. He's not actively rebelling against the system, but he's also non-conforming to it. He's creating this space of refusal within a very rigid and demanding environment.
And how does Han connect Bartleby to the idea of the Burnout Society? They seem like very different situations.
Well, Byung-Chul Han draws a distinction between Bartleby and the modern burnout sufferer. He argues that Bartleby is withdrawing from a disciplinary society, but he's not driven by the same pressure to achieve that defines our modern burnout culture. Bartleby is simply choosing not to participate, while the burnout sufferer is often collapsing under the weight of their own self-imposed expectations.
So there's a key difference there in their relationship to the system. Bartleby is making a conscious choice to withdraw, while the burnout sufferer is often trapped in a cycle of relentless performance that they feel unable to escape.
Exactly. And Byung-Chul Han uses Bartleby to highlight the possibility of resistance, even within a system that seems designed to crush individuality and creativity. He suggests that Bartleby's "I would prefer not to" can be a powerful act of defiance against the violence of positivity.
That's a really interesting point, but the ending of the story is pretty bleak, isn't it? Bartleby ends up dying in prison after having worked at the dead letter office. Is Han suggesting that that's a premonition of our own societal trajectory?
It's certainly a powerful image, and it's hard not to see the parallels, right? Between the dead letters, this communication that never reaches its destination, and the sense of emptiness and isolation that Han describes in the Burnout Society. It raises the question of whether our own relentless pursuit of achievement is ultimately leading us towards a similar kind of spiritual dead end.
It's a pretty sobering thought. So, is there any hope? Is there any way out of this cycle of relentless performance and exhaustion that Han describes?
Well, he doesn't offer any easy solutions, but he does point us towards some potential paths. And one of the most intriguing is through the work of the Austrian writer Peter Hanke.
Now, Hanke takes a very different approach to the idea of tiredness, doesn't he? He sees it not as something negative, but as something potentially positive and even transformative.
That's right. Hanke talks about fundamental tiredness, a kind of slowing down, a letting go of the ego that allows for a different kind of seeing and being. And he contrasts this with the exhaustion of burnout, which is a state of depletion and frustration. Fundamental tiredness is more of an intentional state of being, a conscious choice to step back from that constant pressure, to perform, and to allow ourselves to simply be.
It's a fascinating idea. So how does Hanke's concept of fundamental tiredness differ from the exhaustion that Han describes as a symptom of the Burnout Society?
Well, Byung-Chul Han sees exhaustion as a consequence of the violence of positivity, right? It's the result of constantly pushing ourselves beyond our limits, of never allowing ourselves to rest or to simply be. Hanke's fundamental tiredness, on the other hand, it's not about depletion, it's about a deliberate slowing down, a conscious choice to step off the treadmill of achievement and to embrace a different pace of life.
So it's not about giving up or becoming passive. It's about finding a more sustainable way of being in the world, a way that honors our need for rest and renewal.
Exactly. And Hanke suggests that this kind of fundamental tiredness can actually be a source of creativity and insight. When we slow down and allow ourselves to simply be, We open up space for new possibilities to emerge. We're no longer trying to force things to happen, but allowing them to unfold in their own time and in their own way.
That's a really intriguing idea. But how do we cultivate this kind of fundamental tiredness in a world that seems to value speed, efficiency, and constant productivity above all else? Is it even possible to embrace this kind of slowing down in our fast-paced, hyper-connected society?
That's a great question, and it's one that we'll need to explore further as we continue our deep dive into Byung-Chul Han's work. He offers some insights into how we might begin to resist the violence of positivity and create a more balanced and fulfilling way of life, but it's certainly not an easy path.
So it sounds like we've got a lot more to unpack, but before we move on, I want to make sure we're clear on what we've covered so far. We've talked about Han's concept of the Burnout Society, the violence of positivity, and the loss of contemplation. We also looked at how he uses Melville's character, Bartleby, to highlight the possibility of resistance within a system that seems designed to crush individuality and creativity. And we've introduced Hanke's idea of fundamental tiredness as a potential antidote to the exhaustion and frustration of burnout. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's a great overview of what we've discussed so far, and I think it sets us up nicely to delve deeper into Han's analysis of the relationship between the Burnout Society and technology, as well as his thoughts on how we might begin to cultivate a more balanced and fulfilling way of life in a world that often seems to value speed and efficiency over everything else.
Perfect. So let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our exploration of Han's work, focusing on the role of technology in the Burnout Society, and his suggestions for how we might resist the violence of positivity and reclaim our time, our attention, and ultimately, our lives. Okay, so we've established that Byung-Chul Han sees this strong link between our modern obsession with achievement and this feeling of burnout that so many people are experiencing. And he even calls it a new form of violence, the violence of positivity. But what role does technology play in all of this? It feels like our devices and the constant stream of information are definitely contributing to the problem.
Oh, absolutely. Byung-Chul Han definitely agrees with you there. He argues that digital media, with its endless notifications and demands for attention, and this pressure to present a perfect image, is really deeply implicated in the burnout phenomenon.
It's like our smartphones have become these little externalized versions of that performance drive that Han describes. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others, showcasing our achievements, seeking validation through likes and shares.
Yeah, exactly. And it creates this situation where we're always on, always performing, even in our leisure time. And Byung-Chul Han argues that this constant digital stimulation is incredibly damaging because it prevents us from truly disconnecting and recharging. It keeps us trapped in this cycle of achievement and performance, even when we're supposed to be relaxing or spending time with loved ones.
So what's the solution? Do we need to, completely disconnect from technology to escape this burnout cycle? I mean, technology is so integrated into our lives now, it's hard to imagine functioning without it.
Yeah, I mean, Han doesn't necessarily advocate for complete disconnection, but he does really emphasize the importance of developing a more critical and conscious relationship with technology. So setting boundaries, creating spaces for digital detox, and reclaiming our time and attention from those constant demands of the digital world.
That makes sense. It's about finding a balance, right? Learning to use technology as a tool rather than letting it control us.
Exactly. Being mindful of how we're using it and how it's impacting our well-being, and recognizing the ways it can contribute to that violence of positivity, and making conscious choices to kind of mitigate those effects.
Okay, so we talked about how technology can amplify this pressure to perform and contribute to burnout. But what about solutions? Does Han offer any suggestions for how we could resist this violence of positivity and actually create a more balanced and fulfilling life?
Well, he doesn't offer any easy fixes, but he does point us towards some interesting possibilities. And one key idea he explores is the power of negativity. Remember, he argues that our world is suffering from an excess of positivity, this relentless, yes we can mentality that leaves no room for limits or boundaries.
Right, he contrasts this with the negativity that defined Foucault's disciplinary society, right? But I still struggle with this idea. Isn't negativity like a bad thing? Why would we want to invite more negativity into our lives?
Well, that's where it gets a little tricky, because he's not talking about negativity in a purely pessimistic sense. He's not advocating for doom and gloom. He's talking about the power of saying no, of setting limits, of resisting that constant pressure to do more, be more, achieve more.
So it's about reclaiming some of that "I would prefer not to" spirit from Bartleby.
In a way, yeah. But it's also about recognizing that negativity, in the right doses, can be a source of creativity and freedom. It allows us to kind of step outside the relentless flow of the performance society and create spaces for reflection, for contemplation, for simply being.
That makes sense. It's about giving ourselves permission to not be on all the time, to not always be striving for something more.
Exactly. And he suggests that we need to rediscover the value of things like boredom, solitude, even stillness. These are things that our hyperactive, always-on culture that seems to actively reject, but they're actually essential for our well-being.
I think we've all experienced that feeling of being overwhelmed by the constant demands of the modern world, right? Like, I know I've caught myself scheduling relaxation time in my calendar, which seems a bit ironic, but it highlights how we've come to view even rest as something that needs to be optimized and scheduled.
Yeah, that's a great example of how the violence of positivity has infiltrated even our leisure time. And Han argues that we need to resist this tendency to overschedule and optimize every aspect of our lives, to create space for spontaneity, for unplanned moments, for simply being present in the world without any particular agenda.
That almost sounds like a form of meditation, a deliberate practice of turning away from the noise and demands of the world and just allowing ourselves to be.
It's definitely a practice, and it requires a conscious effort. But he believes the rewards are well worth it. He argues that by reclaiming these spaces of negativity, we can begin to resist the violence of positivity and reconnect with a deeper sense of ourselves and the world around us.
So how do we actually do that? Where do we start? It's easy to say be more mindful or create space for boredom. But in a world that's constantly demanding our attention, how do we actually, put those ideas into practice?
Well, Han suggests starting with small changes. It could be as simple as setting aside a few minutes each day to just disconnect from technology, be present with your thoughts and feelings, or making a conscious effort to engage in activities that allow you to slow down and focus on the present moment, like spending time in nature, reading a book, listening to music.
Those are all good suggestions. But isn't there a danger of becoming too withdrawn, too isolated? Connection with others is also important for our well-being, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. He's not advocating for a retreat into pure solitude. He's talking about finding that balance between the demands of the performance society and the need for deep, meaningful connection, both with ourselves and with others.
And this is where his discussion of Peter Hanke's tired community comes in, right? He sees this idea of shared tiredness as a potential antidote to the isolation and alienation of the Burnout Society.
Yeah, he finds a lot of resonance in Hanke's vision of a community united not by achievement or performance, but by a shared recognition of our limits and our need for rest and connection. He calls it a Pentecost of exhaustion, which is such a powerful image.
It is a powerful image. It suggests that our shared vulnerability, our shared experience of tiredness and exhaustion, could actually be a source of strength and connection. It's a beautiful idea, but it also seems somewhat utopian, right? I mean, is it even realistic to achieve this kind of collective slowing down in our fast-paced world?
Yeah, that's a question that each of us needs to grapple with. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does suggest that change starts with individual choices. If we can start to make small changes in our own lives, if we can begin to resist the violence of positivity, reclaim our time and attention, then perhaps we can start to create the conditions for a more balanced and fulfilling way of life, both individually and collectively.
So it's not about finding some grand solution or waiting for society to change. It's about taking responsibility for our own well-being and making choices that align with our values, even if those choices go against the grain of the dominant culture.
Yeah, and perhaps those individual choices, those small acts of resistance, will eventually create the space for a new kind of community, a tired community, where rest and connection are valued as much as achievement and performance. A community where we can say no to the violence of positivity and yes to a more balanced and fulfilling way of being.
It's a compelling vision, and one that I think we'll all need to ponder further. But before we wrap up our deep dive into Han's work, I wanted to touch on one more point that you highlighted in your notes. This idea of embracing our own vulnerability.
Oh, that's a great point to bring up. Han argues that a burnout society is obsessed with strength, efficiency, and self-optimization. And this creates a culture where vulnerability is seen as a weakness, something to be hidden or overcome.
And yet, as we've been discussing, it's this pursuit of invulnerability that's actually making us sick, right? It's leading to burnout, exhaustion, and a whole host of other problems.
Exactly. And Han suggests that we need to reclaim our vulnerability, to recognize that it's not a weakness, but a source of strength and connection. He argues that by embracing our imperfections and limitations, we can create a more compassionate and humane society.
So it's not about trying to be perfect or to achieve some unattainable ideal. It's about accepting ourselves as we are with all of our flaws and vulnerabilities.
That's a great way to put it, and I think this is one of the most important takeaways from Han's work. He reminds us that true strength comes not from denying our vulnerability, but from embracing it.
It's a powerful message, and one that I think we all need to hear in a world that often tells us that we need to be strong, independent, and self-sufficient all the time. But before we go too far down that path, let's bring it back to you and what you've been struggling with. You mentioned feeling burned out, and it sounds like some of Han's ideas are resonating with your experience. How do you see his work applying to your own life? What are some key takeaways that you can use to maybe start creating a less burnt out, more fulfilling existence?
That's a great question, and one that I think we should explore in more detail as we wrap up our deep dive into Han's work. He offers some powerful insights into the nature of burnout and the forces that contribute to it, but ultimately it's up to each of us to find ways to apply his ideas to our own lives and create positive change.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and focus on how we can take some of these, abstract ideas and turn them into concrete actions. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I know it can be overwhelming to try to process it all at once. So let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and see if we can distill some key takeaways that you can actually start implementing in your own life. All right, so let's get into some practical steps that people can take based on Byung-Chul Han's ideas. He doesn't exactly give us a step-by-step manual, but his work offers this framework for thinking about burnout and some potential paths forward.
Yeah, and one of the first things you might consider is how to recognize the symptoms of burnout in your own life, because it's not always as obvious as you might think.
Right. It's easy to kind of brush off those feelings of exhaustion or frustration as just part of modern life. But Han helps us understand that burnout is more than just being tired or stressed, right? It's this deeper sense of depletion, this feeling that nothing you do is ever enough, and a kind of cynicism that can creep into all aspects of your life.
Exactly. And, it can manifest in different ways for different people. So how do you experience physical symptoms like fatigue, insomnia, or headaches? Emotionally, you might feel irritable, anxious, maybe even depressed. And mentally, you just find it hard to concentrate, make decisions, or feel motivated about anything.
So if you're recognizing some of those symptoms in yourself, what can you do? Where do you even begin to address this feeling of burnout?
Well, the first step is just acknowledging that there's a problem, right? Han points out that we often try to just push through burnout, ignore the signs, and just keep performing. But that only makes things worse in the long run.
It's that yes, we can mentality again, right? The very thing that Han argues is contributing to the problem in the first place.
Precisely. So instead of pushing through, try stepping back and assessing, what's driving your burnout? Is it work pressure, unrealistic expectations in your personal life, the constant demands of social media? Once you identify the sources, then you can start to make changes.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about getting to the root of the problem, understanding what's contributing to those feelings of burnout, and then taking concrete steps to address those underlying issues.
Exactly. And this is where Han's emphasis on the power of negativity comes in. Don't be afraid to say no, set boundaries, protect your time and energy.
So giving yourself permission to opt out, to step back from the constant demands of that performance society, even if it means disappointing others or going against the grain of what's expected.
Exactly. And remember Han's suggestion to rediscover the value of boredom, solitude, and stillness. These are things our culture devalues, but they can be incredibly restorative, help you reconnect with yourself.
And this kind of resonates with what we talked about earlier with Peter Hanke's idea of fundamental tiredness, right? Intentionally slowing down, allowing yourself to simply be, and creating that space for reflection and renewal.
Yes. And it's not just about individual actions either. Han also highlights the importance of connection and community. He suggests that, sharing your experiences with others, finding support and understanding, that can help you feel less alone, more empowered to make those positive changes.
Yeah, it's about building that community where vulnerability is accepted, where rest is valued, and where achievement isn't the sole measure of worth.
Exactly. And while Han doesn't offer, a blueprint for creating this kind of community, he suggests that it starts with individual actions. Each of us making those conscious choices to resist the violence of positivity and prioritize our well-being.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Byung-Chul Han's work, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways to consider. First, remember that burnout is a real problem, and it's not your fault. It's a symptom of a larger societal pressure to perform that's really impacting all of us. Second, recognize that you have the power to make changes in your own life, even small ones, to resist the violence of positivity and reclaim your time, your attention, and your well-being. And finally, don't be afraid to reach out for support. Connect with others who understand what you're going through. Find a therapist if you need to. And remember that you're not alone in this struggle.
Those are excellent takeaways. And I would add maybe one more thought from Peter Henke that might be helpful to kind of reflect on. He said, tiredness is the most humane form of rebellion. So if you're feeling burnt out, exhausted, overwhelmed, it's okay to rest, slow down, and say no to the demands of the world. And in doing so, you might just be participating in a quiet revolution that's reclaiming what it means to be human in a world that often seems to have forgotten.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Byung-Chul Han's work. We hope you found it insightful and empowering. And remember, creating a less burnt out, more fulfilling life. It's a journey, not a destination. Be kind to yourself, take things one step at a time, and don't be afraid to ask for help along the way.